Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the United States no longer controls the Mississippi River. Imagine foreign soldiers standing at the gateway of America's most important trade route. Imagine a battle so unlikely that even many of the people fighting it believed they would lose. And imagine that the fate of an entire nation would depend on farmers, frontiersmen, sailors, freedmen, Native American allies, and even pirates standing shoulder to shoulder against the most powerful empire on earth. This isn't fiction. This really happened. In the winter of 1814, America came closer to losing its future than most people realize. And the astonishing events that followed would change the course of history forever. The Mississippi River flowed silently beneath the moonlight, carrying dark waters toward the Gulf of Mexico. Few people understood that the future of the United States was drifting along those waters. In 1814, America was still a young nation. The country had won independence from Britain only a generation earlier. Many Americans still remembered stories from the Revolution. Some had fought in it themselves. The United States was growing rapidly, pushing westward into new territories. Farmers were clearing land. Settlers were building towns. Merchants were creating new fortunes. Yet beneath the optimism lurked a dangerous reality. America was once again at war with Britain. And this time, the stakes were enormous. The conflict known as the War of 1812 had already dragged on for years. Battles had been fought across forests, lakes, rivers, and oceans. Cities had been threatened. Lives had been lost. Neither side had achieved a decisive victory. Then came a shocking moment. In August 1814, British forces marched into Washington. Government buildings burned. Smoke filled the sky. The young nation's capital was humiliated. Across America, fear spread. Many wondered whether the country could survive. But even as newspapers reported the destruction, an even greater threat was developing hundreds of miles away. British leaders were planning a strike that could cripple the United States permanently. Their target was New Orleans. And most Americans had no idea what was coming. To understand why New Orleans mattered so much, you first have to understand the Mississippi River. Today, highways, railroads, and airplanes connect America from coast to coast. But in the early 1800s, things were very different. The Mississippi River was the superhighway of North America. Thousands of farmers depended on it. Countless merchants relied upon it. Entire communities survived because of it. Every year, enormous quantities of cotton, tobacco, flour, pork, and other products floated downstream toward international markets. If that river were cut off, vast portions of the United States would suffer. And at the mouth of the Mississippi sat one city: New Orleans. The city was unlike any other place in America. French traditions mixed with Spanish influences. African culture blended with Caribbean customs. Different languages filled the streets. Different religions shared neighborhoods. Different peoples lived side by side. The city pulsed with energy. Ships from around the world crowded its docks. Sailors exchanged stories from distant oceans. Merchants negotiated fortunes. Musicians entertained crowds late into the night. But beneath the excitement was an uncomfortable truth. New Orleans was vulnerable. Whoever controlled the city controlled access to the Mississippi River. British strategists understood this perfectly. Some military planners believed capturing New Orleans could permanently weaken the United States. The plan was bold. British troops would seize the city. The Mississippi River would fall under British control. America's westward growth could be slowed or even stopped. Perhaps the United States would eventually split apart. To British officials, it seemed like a reasonable possibility. After all, Britain was the greatest global power of the age. Its navy dominated the seas. Its soldiers had fought across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. For decades, the British Empire had expanded across the world. Its red-coated troops had become symbols of military strength. Now many of those same soldiers were heading toward Louisiana. The timing favored Britain. A massive conflict in Europe had finally reached a turning point. For years, one man had dominated the continent. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Kings feared him. Generals studied him. Nations united against him. His wars transformed Europe. But by 1814, Napoleon had been defeated. Suddenly Britain no longer needed all its troops in Europe. Veteran regiments became available for new campaigns. Some of the empire's finest soldiers were selected for an expedition against America. Many had survived brutal battles in Spain. Others had marched through Portugal. Some had faced French artillery and cavalry countless times. These were not inexperienced recruits. They were hardened professionals. Their officers expected victory. Their soldiers expected victory. Even many Americans expected victory, for Britain. Meanwhile, New Orleans continued its daily routine. Most residents knew war existed. But war often felt far away. Ships still arrived. Markets still opened. Businesses still operated. Children still played in the streets. Yet rumors were spreading. British warships had been spotted. More reports followed. Then more. Whispers became conversations. Conversations became concern. Concern slowly became fear. The enemy was coming closer. Far away, a man named Andrew Jackson was already preparing. Jackson was unlike most military leaders. He looked thin and almost fragile. His health was often poor. Years of hardship had left scars both visible and invisible. Yet few people doubted his determination. He possessed a fierce personality that could inspire allies and intimidate enemies. When Jackson believed something needed to be done, he pursued it relentlessly. Now he faced perhaps the greatest challenge of his career. Defending New Orleans. The situation looked grim. Jackson did not command a huge professional army. He lacked many supplies. His forces were scattered. Communication was difficult. Time was running out. Yet he understood something critical. If New Orleans fell, the consequences might echo through generations. Jackson immediately began gathering every available defender. Regular soldiers joined the effort. Local militia units answered the call. Frontiersmen arrived carrying rifles. Volunteers appeared from neighboring regions. Free black soldiers offered their services. Native American allies supported the defense. Even groups that many Americans distrusted would soon become important. Jackson needed everyone. Because the enemy approaching Louisiana was powerful. Very powerful. As autumn faded into winter, British ships assembled in the Gulf of Mexico. One vessel became dozens. Dozens became an invasion fleet. Hundreds of cannons crossed the water. Thousands of soldiers crowded aboard transports. Supplies filled cargo holds. The expedition represented one of Britain's largest military efforts against the United States during the war. The commanders believed success was within reach. On maps, the objective appeared straightforward. Land troops. Advance toward New Orleans. Capture the city. Secure the river. Win a major strategic victory. Reality, however, would prove more complicated. Nature itself stood in their path. The Louisiana coastline was difficult terrain. Swamps stretched for miles. Mud swallowed boots. Mosquitoes filled the air. Waterways twisted through confusing marshlands. Even experienced guides could become lost. Still, British planners remained confident. They had overcome challenges before. Surely they could overcome this one. As December approached, the first stages of the operation began. British ships moved closer. Scouts gathered information. Officers studied maps. Final preparations accelerated. And somewhere beyond the horizon, an invasion force prepared to strike. The people of New Orleans could not yet see them. But history was already moving toward the city. A collision was coming. One that would decide far more than the fate of a single city. One that would help determine the future of the United States itself. And neither side yet realized how extraordinary the coming battle would become. December 1814, The waters of the Gulf of Mexico were crowded with ships carrying one of the most powerful military forces ever sent against the United States. From a distance, the fleet seemed endless. Warships guarded the transports. Cannons lined the decks. Thousands of soldiers waited below. The British Empire had arrived. To many military observers, the outcome seemed obvious. Britain possessed advantages almost everywhere. Its navy was the strongest in the world. Its officers were experienced. Its troops had survived years of brutal warfare against the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte. Some had fought in famous battles that shaped European history. Others had marched across mountains, rivers, and battlefields stained by years of conflict. These were veterans. Men who had seen war at its worst. Men who believed they could defeat almost any opponent. Leading the expedition was Edward Pakenham, a respected officer with an impressive military record. Many expected him to achieve another victory in Louisiana. British confidence was high. American confidence was not. Throughout the United States, many citizens worried. The memory of Washington's burning still haunted the country. Only months earlier, British troops had entered the capital. Government buildings had been set ablaze. The shock had spread across the nation. If Britain could burn Washington, what would stop it from capturing New Orleans? Some feared the answer was nothing. Others feared something even worse. If New Orleans fell, Britain's position at the mouth of the Mississippi could allow it to pressure the entire western frontier. Trade could be disrupted. Economic growth could slow dramatically. Political tensions could increase. The future suddenly looked uncertain. Yet while politicians debated and newspapers speculated, events were moving rapidly in Louisiana. British forces began navigating the difficult waterways leading toward New Orleans. The terrain immediately created problems. Maps were incomplete. Channels twisted unexpectedly. Mud slowed movement. Swamps swallowed equipment. The environment itself seemed determined to resist the invasion. Soldiers accustomed to European battlefields found themselves struggling through unfamiliar wetlands. Mosquitoes attacked relentlessly. Humidity soaked uniforms. Progress became frustratingly slow. Still, the British continued forward. They believed speed would eventually overcome these difficulties. If they reached New Orleans quickly enough, the city might fall before its defenses were fully prepared. Meanwhile, General Andrew Jackson worked tirelessly. Every report mattered. Every rumor mattered. Every hour mattered. Jackson understood that time was his most valuable ally. The longer the British advance took, the stronger his defenses could become. So he pushed relentlessly. Messengers rode across the countryside. Militia units received urgent orders. Volunteers streamed toward New Orleans. Weapons were distributed. Fortifications expanded. Defensive plans evolved almost daily. Jackson also made a controversial decision. He accepted help from an unlikely source. The famous pirate leader Jean Lafitte operated in the region with a group of smugglers and privateers. Many officials considered Lafitte a criminal. Yet Jackson recognized something important. Lafitte and his men possessed valuable knowledge of local waterways. They also had fighting experience. Most importantly, they had artillery. In a moment when every capable defender mattered, Jackson chose practicality over pride. The decision would prove significant. As British troops pushed inland, they began receiving encouraging reports. American defenses did not appear overwhelming. The city seemed vulnerable. Many officers believed victory was drawing closer. Then came a surprise. On December 23rd, British advance forces established positions alarmingly close to New Orleans. The news reached Jackson quickly. Some commanders might have waited. Some might have remained defensive. Jackson chose another option. Attack. Immediately. That evening, darkness covered the Louisiana landscape. The air felt heavy. Visibility was poor. British troops were still organizing their positions. Many expected a quiet night. Instead, chaos exploded around them. American forces surged forward. Gunfire erupted through the darkness. Cannons flashed. Smoke rolled across the fields. Officers shouted orders that disappeared into the confusion. Men struggled to identify friend from foe. The battle quickly became a nightmare of noise and uncertainty. For British soldiers, the attack was unexpected. For American troops, the attack was risky. Neither side achieved a decisive victory. Yet the psychological impact was enormous. The British suddenly realized their opponent would not simply wait to be defeated. Jackson had demonstrated aggression, determination, confidence. The Americans, meanwhile, gained something equally important: hope. The British could be challenged. The British could bleed. The British could be stopped. After the fighting ended, both sides assessed the situation. British commanders still believed they could win. But they now understood the campaign might be harder than expected. Jackson used the time wisely. His men strengthened a defensive position along the Rodriguez Canal. At first glance, it appeared unimpressive. A ditch, earthworks, mud, logs. Nothing about it looked legendary. Yet history often hides in ordinary places. Day after day, soldiers worked. They dug deeper. They built higher. They reinforced weak points. Artillery pieces were carefully positioned. Fields of fire were established. The line slowly transformed into a formidable obstacle. Behind the defenses stood an unusual army. Professional soldiers, militia volunteers, hunters, farmers, merchants, free black troops, Native American allies, sailors, pirates. Few military planners would have designed such a force. Yet it was the force Jackson had. And it was the force that would soon face one of the greatest tests in American history. As Christmas passed and the New Year approached, tension filled Louisiana. The British prepared for a major offensive. The Americans prepared to resist. Both armies understood that a decisive confrontation was coming. The question was not whether a great battle would occur. The question was who would survive it. Neither side knew that within days, a single morning would become one of the most astonishing moments in American military history. And when the smoke finally cleared, the world would struggle to believe what had happened. As the final days of 1814 slipped away, the fate of New Orleans rested on a narrow strip of muddy ground. To a casual observer, the American defenses looked almost disappointing. There were no towering stone walls, no massive fortresses, no grand castles like those found in Europe. Instead, there was dirt, mud, timber, a canal, and behind it stood a collection of men who, on paper, should never have been able to defeat the British Empire. Yet General Andrew Jackson believed the position could hold. The Rodriguez Canal stretched across the landscape, creating a natural obstacle. His soldiers deepened it. Earth removed from the ditch was piled into a protective embankment. Logs reinforced weak areas. Cannons were placed where they could sweep the open fields ahead. Every day brought improvements. Every hour strengthened the line. Jackson inspected the works constantly. He rarely appeared satisfied. Whenever he found a weakness, he demanded it be corrected. Whenever he saw soldiers resting, he often ordered more work. Many men were exhausted. But Jackson understood that sweat now could save lives later. Across the battlefield, British commanders studied the American position. They remained confident. Perhaps not as confident as before the surprise night attack, but confident nonetheless. The British Army had faced strong defenses before. Many officers believed that disciplined infantry could eventually break through. After all, they possessed veteran troops. Professional soldiers. Men trained to advance under fire. Men who had survived campaigns across Europe. Surely a collection of militia and volunteers could not stop them forever. Still, the British needed information. Reconnaissance parties observed American positions. Officers measured distances. Engineers evaluated possible attack routes. The more they studied the battlefield, the more complicated it appeared. The terrain was difficult. Open ground exposed attackers to artillery fire. Wet soil complicated movement. The canal itself created another obstacle. Yet no obstacle seemed impossible. The British continued preparing. Meanwhile, New Orleans waited. Inside the city, fear and hope existed side by side. Some residents packed valuables. Others prayed. Many followed every rumor. One day people heard the British were about to attack. The next day they heard the British were retreating. Neither rumor proved true. The waiting became its own kind of torture. No one knew exactly what would happen. No one knew whether their homes would survive. No one knew whether the city would still belong to the United States a month later. As the new year arrived, both armies remained locked in a tense standoff. Then, on January 1, 1815, the silence shattered. British artillery opened fire. Cannons roared across the Louisiana plain. Shells screamed through the air. Explosions erupted around American positions. The bombardment signaled the beginning of a major effort to weaken Jackson's defenses. American artillery answered immediately. Thunder rolled across the battlefield. Smoke drifted through the morning air. For hours, the two sides exchanged fire. The ground shook repeatedly. Trees splintered. Earth flew into the sky. Men on both sides experienced the terrifying power of heavy artillery. Yet, when the smoke finally cleared, something surprising became apparent. The American line remained intact. The bombardment had not achieved the decisive result British commanders wanted. Jackson's defenses still stood. His soldiers still occupied their positions. The coming battle would have to be decided another way. In the days that followed, British leaders prepared for a full-scale assault. Detailed plans were created. Units received assignments. Officers reviewed objectives. Everything depended on coordination. Everything depended on timing. Everything depended on discipline. The strategy appeared straightforward. A powerful attack would strike the American line. Multiple units would advance simultaneously. Engineers would help overcome obstacles. Once gaps appeared in the defenses, British troops would exploit them. The plan looked sound on paper. But battlefields rarely respect paper plans. As preparations continued, an atmosphere of anticipation settled over both camps. Soldiers cleaned weapons. Officers checked equipment. Messengers carried final instructions. Many men sensed that a historic moment was approaching. Some wrote letters home. Others spent quiet moments reflecting on their lives. A few openly discussed their fears. Because despite all the training and confidence, every soldier understood one truth. Not everyone would survive what came next. The British Army expected victory. The American defenders hoped for survival. Yet hidden within the fog of the future was an outcome that neither side fully anticipated. Soon, thousands of men would march into one of the most famous battles in American history. A battle that would last only a short time. A battle whose results would shock both nations. A battle that would transform Andrew Jackson from a respected general into a national legend. And on the cold morning of January 8, 1815, the world would witness just how much history could change in a matter of minutes. The morning of January 8, 1815, arrived wrapped in fog. A thick gray mist covered the Louisiana battlefield. Visibility was limited. Shapes appeared and disappeared like ghosts. The silence felt unnatural. Thousands of men waited. Some gripped muskets tightly. Others stared into the darkness ahead. Many could hear their own hearts beating. They knew this day would decide everything. On the American side, General Andrew Jackson moved along the defensive line. He spoke with officers. He checked positions. He encouraged his men. Despite the enormous pressure, Jackson appeared calm. His soldiers drew confidence from his presence. Behind the earthworks stood an army unlike any other. Regular U.S. soldiers, Tennessee riflemen, Kentucky volunteers, free black battalions, sailors, Marines, Choctaw warriors, men from many different backgrounds. Under ordinary circumstances, these groups might never have fought together. But this was no ordinary circumstance. Ahead of them stood one of the strongest armies in the world. Across the field, British troops prepared to advance. Their red uniforms were barely visible through the fog. Many soldiers believed victory was only hours away. Their commanders had confidence in their training and discipline. The British Army had defeated powerful enemies before. It had fought across continents. It had survived countless campaigns. Few expected defeat. As dawn approached, final orders moved through the ranks. Officers checked watches. Units formed lines. Weapons were inspected one last time. The attack was about to begin. Then came a problem. A serious problem. Some of the equipment needed for the assault was delayed. Confusion spread among certain units. Messages arrived late. Timetables slipped. Individually, these issues seemed small. Together, they created dangerous complications. Still, the attack moved forward. The British could not afford endless delays. At approximately dawn, thousands of British soldiers began advancing toward the American line. The fog slowly lifted. The battlefield emerged. And suddenly the British troops found themselves exposed. The open ground between the armies offered little protection. American defenders watched from behind earthworks. Cannons stood ready. Rifles were loaded. Every eye focused forward. Then the first major volleys erupted. American artillery opened fire. The effect was devastating. Cannons blasted huge gaps into advancing formations. Iron shot tore through ranks of soldiers. The noise was overwhelming. Thunder seemed to explode across the battlefield. Yet the British continued forward. Their training demanded it. Their discipline required it. Officers shouted commands. Flags moved through the smoke. Lines pressed ahead. But every yard came at a terrible cost. American riflemen joined the battle. Unlike smoothbore muskets, many frontier rifles offered remarkable accuracy. Experienced marksmen carefully selected targets. Officers became particularly vulnerable. One by one, leaders began falling. Each loss created additional confusion. Still the British advanced. Some units came remarkably close to the American defenses. But reaching the line and breaking through it were two very different challenges. The canal created obstacles. The embankment created obstacles. The relentless American fire created obstacles. Momentum began slowing. Then slowing further. Then stopping altogether. At the center of the battlefield, tragedy struck the British command. General Edward Pakenham was hit while attempting to rally his troops. Seriously wounded, he was carried from the field. The loss shocked the army. A commander was more than a strategist. He was a symbol. A source of confidence. A source of direction. Without him, coordination became increasingly difficult. As the battle continued, additional senior officers were wounded or killed. The chain of command suffered repeated blows. Orders became harder to communicate. Confusion increased. Meanwhile, the American line remained largely intact. Jackson's defenses were doing exactly what they had been designed to do. The battlefield was becoming a nightmare for the attackers. Smoke drifted across the plain. Wounded men called for help. Officers struggled to reorganize shattered formations. Yet no breakthrough appeared. The attack was failing. And with every passing minute, the costs grew higher. British soldiers continued displaying extraordinary courage. Many advanced despite witnessing devastating casualties around them. Many followed orders even when survival seemed unlikely. But courage alone could not overcome the circumstances. The position was simply too strong. The firepower was too intense. The defenses were too effective. Eventually, British commanders faced a painful reality. The assault could not succeed. Retreat orders began spreading. Slowly at first. Then more widely. Surviving units started withdrawing from the battlefield. The great attack was over. The Battle of New Orleans had effectively been decided. And the result stunned everyone. The army expected to conquer New Orleans had been stopped. Not after days of fighting. Not after weeks of fighting. But within a single morning. When casualty reports emerged, the numbers seemed almost unbelievable. British losses were devastating. American losses were astonishingly low by comparison. People on both sides struggled to comprehend what had happened. It felt impossible. Yet it was real. A young nation had stood against one of the most powerful military forces on Earth and emerged victorious. The men behind the earthworks began realizing the truth. They had done it. New Orleans still stood. The Mississippi remained American. And a battle that would become legendary had just entered history. But an even stranger twist was still waiting. Because unknown to nearly everyone on the battlefield, the war itself had already been ended by diplomats thousands of miles away. The shocking revelation would soon cross the Atlantic. And when it did, it would make the Battle of New Orleans one of the most extraordinary chapters in American history. As the smoke drifted away from the battlefield outside New Orleans, soldiers on both sides struggled to understand what had just happened. The fighting had lasted only a few hours. Yet the consequences would echo for generations. American troops walked across the muddy fields in disbelief. Only days earlier, many had feared disaster. Now they were witnessing one of the greatest victories in American history. The defensive line still stood. The city was safe. The British attack had failed. General Andrew Jackson remained cautious. He knew battles could be deceptive. Rumors often traveled faster than facts. Until he was certain the British threat had passed, he refused to celebrate too soon. Across the battlefield, British forces were dealing with a very different reality. The losses were severe. Many respected officers were dead or wounded. Among them was General Edward Pakenham, whose death shocked the entire expedition. Only hours earlier he had expected to lead a victorious army into New Orleans. Now he would never leave Louisiana alive. His death became one of the most tragic moments of the campaign. British soldiers who survived the battle later remembered the terrible confusion, the relentless American fire, and the sense that everything had gone wrong at once. Some blamed mistakes. Others blamed bad luck. Still others blamed the terrain itself. Most agreed on one thing. The attack had been far more difficult than anyone anticipated. For several days after the battle, uncertainty remained. Would the British try again? Would reinforcements arrive? Would another assault follow? Jackson refused to take chances. His troops remained alert. Defenses stayed manned. Weapons stayed loaded. The possibility of another attack could not be ignored. Then a remarkable piece of news began making its way across the Atlantic Ocean. The information traveled slowly by modern standards. No telephones existed. No radio existed. No internet existed. Messages crossed oceans by ship. As a result, events often unfolded before leaders learned what had already happened elsewhere. And that is exactly what occurred. Weeks before the Battle of New Orleans, diplomats representing Britain and the United States had been negotiating peace in Europe. The talks took place in the city of Ghent. Both sides were exhausted by war. Neither nation wanted endless fighting. Eventually, an agreement was reached. On December 24, 1814, representatives signed the Treaty of Ghent. The war was effectively over. There was only one problem. Nobody in New Orleans knew. The treaty had been signed more than 2 weeks before the famous battle. Yet the news had not crossed the ocean in time. As a result, thousands of soldiers fought a major battle after peace had already been agreed upon. Today this fact sounds almost unbelievable. But in the early 19th century, it was entirely possible. Information simply moved too slowly. Ships carrying the news faced long journeys and unpredictable conditions. By the time word finally reached North America, the Battle of New Orleans had already become history. The revelation stunned many people. Some found it tragic. Others found it ironic. A battle that never technically needed to happen had become one of the most important military victories in American history. Yet despite the timing, the battle's impact was enormous. The victory transformed public opinion. For months, Americans had endured uncertainty and fear. Now they had a triumph to celebrate. Newspapers printed dramatic accounts. Citizens held celebrations. Stories spread across the country. The victory gave Americans something they desperately needed: confidence, national pride, a sense that the young republic could survive against powerful opponents. And no individual benefited more from the victory than Andrew Jackson. Before New Orleans, he was respected. After New Orleans, he became a national hero. His name appeared everywhere. His reputation grew rapidly. People admired his determination, his leadership, his willingness to fight when the odds seemed unfavorable. Many Americans began viewing Jackson as the embodiment of frontier toughness and national resilience. The fame would eventually help carry him all the way to the presidency. Years later, he would become the 7th President of the United States. But in January 1815, nobody could fully predict that future. They only knew one thing: Jackson had become a legend. The Battle of New Orleans also reshaped how Americans remembered the entire war. The conflict itself had often been messy and inconclusive. Many battles produced mixed results. Many objectives remained disputed. Yet the dramatic victory at New Orleans created a powerful ending. For many citizens, it felt as though the United States had finished the war on top. That perception mattered. Sometimes history is shaped not only by events themselves but by how people remember them. And Americans remembered New Orleans. They remembered the earthworks. They remembered the fog. They remembered the impossible odds. Most of all, they remembered the victory. But while the battle was ending, another story was beginning. Far across the Atlantic, Europe was once again descending into uncertainty. A man many believed finished forever was preparing a shocking return. A man whose name had terrified kings and emperors alike. A man who refused to disappear quietly. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and within months, he would escape captivity and throw Europe back into chaos. The world thought his story was over. The world was wrong. For a brief moment in early 1815, it seemed that Europe might finally enjoy peace. The long years of war appeared to be ending. Armies were returning home. Governments were rebuilding. Families hoped that the worst was over. After more than a decade of conflict, millions of people wanted nothing more than stability. At the center of these hopes stood one extraordinary fact. Napoleon Bonaparte was gone. Or so everyone believed. Only a year earlier, Napoleon had ruled much of Europe. His armies had marched across the continent. His victories had transformed nations. Kings feared him. Generals studied him. Ordinary citizens spoke his name with a mixture of admiration and terror. Yet after a series of defeats, his empire collapsed. The once powerful emperor was forced to abdicate. The victorious allies removed him from power. To ensure he could never threaten Europe again, they sent him into exile on the small Mediterranean island of Elba. The island was tiny compared to the empire he had ruled. Many believed his story had ended. Many believed history had moved on. Many believed Napoleon would spend the rest of his life quietly fading into obscurity. They underestimated him. Even in exile, Napoleon remained Napoleon. He watched events closely. He studied reports. He listened to rumors. And increasingly, he became convinced that Europe was making mistakes. Meanwhile, the leaders who had defeated him gathered at the famous Congress of Vienna. Their goal was ambitious. They wanted to redesign Europe. Borders would be adjusted. Kingdoms would be reorganized. New agreements would be created. The leaders hoped to build a lasting peace. Yet disagreements quickly emerged. Different nations wanted different outcomes. Arguments filled meeting rooms. Negotiations dragged on. While diplomats debated the future, Napoleon waited. Then, in February 1815, he made a decision that shocked the world. He would return. The plan sounded impossible. He was under observation. His resources were limited. His enemies controlled much of Europe. But Napoleon had spent years accomplishing things others considered impossible. Why stop now? On February 26, he escaped Elba. With only a small force, he sailed toward France. The risk was enormous. If captured, his career would almost certainly end forever. Successful, he might regain power. Few people expected success. After all, France was now ruled by King Louis XVIII. Government officials remained loyal to the restored monarchy. Large armies opposed Napoleon. The odds seemed hopeless. Yet as he marched inland, something remarkable happened. Soldiers sent to arrest him hesitated. Then many joined him. Communities welcomed him. Supporters rallied around him. His legend still held tremendous power. One famous story captured the moment perfectly. Facing troops sent to stop him, Napoleon reportedly stepped forward and challenged them directly. If they wished to shoot their emperor, he declared they could do so. The soldiers did not fire. Instead, many joined him. His return gathered momentum. Day after day, more supporters appeared. The movement grew. The government became increasingly nervous. By March, Napoleon entered Paris. The king fled. The emperor had returned. Europe reacted with alarm. Leaders who had spent years defeating Napoleon could hardly believe the news. The man they had exiled was once again ruling France. Their response was immediate. Coalitions formed. Armies mobilized. Plans were drafted. Diplomats abandoned hopes for a peaceful adjustment. Europe prepared for war once more. This dramatic period became known as the 100 Days. For roughly 100 days, Napoleon reclaimed power and attempted to restore his position. But he faced enormous challenges. His enemies were stronger than before. They had learned from experience. They were determined not to repeat past mistakes. Most importantly, they were united by a common goal. Napoleon had to be defeated permanently. Across Europe, armies began moving. Thousands of soldiers marched towards strategic positions. Supplies were gathered. Weapons were distributed. Generals reviewed battle plans. Everyone understood that another decisive confrontation was approaching. Napoleon understood it too. Time was not on his side. Every day allowed his enemies to strengthen their forces. Every delay increased the danger. He needed a victory. A major victory. A victory large enough to break the coalition before it could fully unite. So he moved quickly. His army marched north into what is now Belgium. The campaign that followed would lead to one of the most famous battles ever fought. A battle remembered more than 2 centuries later. A battle that would determine not only Napoleon's future but the future of Europe itself. A battle where empires, kingdoms, and armies collided in a desperate struggle. A battle called the Battle of Waterloo. And on a rainy field in Belgium, history was preparing to make its final judgment on Napoleon Bonaparte. By June 1815, Europe was holding its breath. For nearly 20 years, nations had fought wars that reshaped the continent. Entire generations had grown up knowing little except conflict. Now everything seemed to be heading toward one final confrontation. At the center of it all stood one man. Napoleon Bonaparte. He had escaped exile. He had reclaimed power. And now he was once again leading an army into battle. But this was not the Napoleon of 1805. This was not the unstoppable conqueror who had crushed coalitions and redrawn maps. Years of war had changed Europe. Years of war had changed Napoleon. His enemies had learned from experience. They knew how dangerous he could be. This time they intended to finish the job. The coalition forming against France included some of Europe's most powerful states. Among the key commanders was Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington. Wellington had spent years fighting Napoleon's armies. He understood French tactics. He understood the strengths of the emperor. More importantly, he understood the dangers of underestimating him. Another major threat to Napoleon came from the east. The experienced Prussian commander Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher was leading a large army toward the battlefield. Napoleon faced a serious problem. If Wellington and Blucher combined their forces, France would face overwhelming numbers. The Emperor needed to defeat them separately. It was a strategy he had used many times before. Move quickly. Strike hard. Destroy one enemy before another can arrive. Then repeat. The plan was simple. Executing it would be far more difficult. In the days before Waterloo, Napoleon launched a rapid campaign in Belgium. Initially, things seemed promising. French forces achieved several successes. Coalition armies were pushed back. Confusion spread among the Allies. For a moment, it appeared that Napoleon might once again perform the impossible. But time was slipping away. Every movement mattered. Every delay mattered. Every mistake mattered. The coming battle would leave little room for error. As armies maneuvered across Belgium, weather became an unexpected factor. Heavy rain soaked the countryside. Roads turned muddy. Fields became difficult to cross. Artillery movements slowed. Supply wagons struggled. Horses became exhausted. The weather affected everyone. But for Napoleon, it created a particular problem. His army often relied on speed and mobility. Mud reduced both. On the evening before the battle, rain continued falling. Soldiers from all sides tried to rest. Many failed. Some sat quietly beside campfires. Others cleaned weapons. Many thought about home. Many wondered whether they would survive the next day. Fear existed in every army. Even experienced veterans felt it. The difference was that experienced veterans learned how to keep moving despite it. Across the battlefield, Wellington selected his defensive position carefully. Near the village of Waterloo, his forces occupied advantageous ground. Yet when dawn arrived, the battlefield looked surprisingly ordinary. Rolling farmland. Mud-soaked fields. Scattered buildings. A few roads. Nothing about the landscape suggested that history was about to change forever. As the sun rose through clouds, French commanders studied the enemy position. Napoleon observed the battlefield. He still believed victory was possible. Perhaps even likely. He had won against difficult odds before. Why not again? Yet one concern remained. Where were the Prussians? Reports suggested that Blucher's army was still active. If it arrived at the wrong moment, everything could change. Napoleon hoped he had enough time. He hoped Wellington could be defeated first. The fate of France depended on it. Across the ridge, Wellington waited. His soldiers waited. The tension was almost unbearable. Then, late in the morning, the first guns fired. Cannons thundered across the countryside. The Battle of Waterloo had begun. Neither side yet understood that within hours one empire would collapse forever. One legend would come to an end. And Europe would enter a completely new chapter of history. The battle would be fierce. It would be chaotic. It would be remembered for centuries. And before the day was over, the name Waterloo would become synonymous with ultimate defeat. The morning of June 18, 1815, began with rain-soaked silence. The fields around Waterloo were heavy with mud. Soldiers stood in cold, damp uniforms. Weapons were wet. Powder was difficult to keep dry. Every army on the field knew one simple truth. Whoever won this day would shape Europe's future. Whoever lost would disappear from power forever. At the center of it all stood Napoleon Bonaparte. From a distance, he looked calm. But inside, pressure was building. This was not just another battle. It was the battle. His entire return to power, the 100 days, depended on victory here. Across the battlefield, the Duke of Wellington waited behind his defensive line. His position was strong. Not perfect. But strong enough to hold. Wellington's strategy was simple. Hold the line. Delay Napoleon. Wait for reinforcements from Blucher. If the Prussians arrived in time, Napoleon would be trapped between two armies. And destroyed. The first major French attack began with brutal force. Artillery opened fire across the ridge. The ground shook. Trees splintered. Smoke spread across the fields. Then French infantry advanced in massive columns. Thousands of soldiers moved forward together. It was an intimidating sight. A wall of disciplined troops advancing under fire. Many expected the British line to break. But Wellington's men held their ground. Volley after volley erupted from the ridge. Musket fire cracked through the smoke. French soldiers fell in large numbers. Still, they kept advancing. Again and again, Napoleon ordered new attacks. He believed pressure would eventually break the enemy. But the battlefield was not responding as expected. The mud slowed movement. Artillery was difficult to reposition. Communication between units became chaotic. Every advantage Napoleon needed was being reduced by conditions and resistance. Hours passed. The battle intensified. Casualties grew on both sides. Then, a critical development occurred. From the east, movement appeared on the horizon. Reports began reaching French commanders. Prussian forces under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher were approaching. At first, Napoleon refused to fully believe it. He had expected delays. He had expected hesitation. But the reports became clearer. Stronger. More urgent. The Prussians were coming. This changed everything. Napoleon now faced a shrinking window of opportunity. He ordered one final major assault against Wellington's center. This was the moment he had been waiting for. If the British line broke now, the battle could still be won. French Imperial Guard units, his most elite soldiers, were committed to the attack. They advanced with discipline and confidence. For a brief moment, it looked like history might turn again. Smoke covered the ridge. Confusion spread. Some British units began to falter. Then Wellington issued a command. Hold. Do not retreat. Fire when you see the whites of their eyes. At close range, British and Allied troops unleashed devastating volleys. The Imperial Guard began to hesitate. Then slow. Then stop. Then something extraordinary happened. The unthinkable. Napoleon's elite guard began to retreat. For the first time in years, his most trusted troops were breaking. The sight spread panic through the French lines. Rumors exploded across the battlefield. Le garde recule! The guard is retreating. That moment changed everything. French morale collapsed. Wellington ordered a full advance. At the same time, Prussian forces struck the French right flank. Napoleon's army was suddenly fighting on two fronts. Chaos replaced order. Units disintegrated. Command structure broke down. The French army, once feared across Europe, began to fall apart. Napoleon tried to stabilize the situation. He moved between units. He issued commands. He attempted to restore control. But the momentum was gone. Even great leaders cannot command an army that no longer believes it can win. As evening approached, the battlefield turned into a retreat. Then a collapse. Then a rout. French soldiers fled in every direction. The Battle of Waterloo was over. Napoleon had been defeated. This time, there would be no return. The consequences were immediate and final. His political power vanished. His army disintegrated. Europe, exhausted by decades of war, finally reached a turning point. Napoleon would soon be sent into permanent exile on the distant island of St. Helena. Far from Europe. Far from power. Far from the world he once tried to shape. And in that moment, the age of Napoleon came to an end. A chapter of history closed. And a new European order began. The aftermath of Waterloo did not feel like a single moment. It felt like the collapse of an entire age. On the battlefield near Waterloo, the silence after the fighting was broken only by the sounds of wounded soldiers and distant movement. Smoke still drifted across the fields. The mud was mixed with debris. Flags lay scattered. Weapons were abandoned where men had dropped them. The army of Napoleon Bonaparte no longer existed as a unified force. It had become fragments. Some units fled in panic. Others tried to regroup. Many simply disappeared into the countryside. Napoleon himself attempted to organize a retreat. But the reality was clear. There would be no recovery from this defeat. This was not a tactical setback. It was the end of his political and military power. Meanwhile, the Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington began assessing the scale of victory. It had come at a heavy cost. Thousands were dead or wounded. Entire units had been devastated. But the result was undeniable. Napoleon's return had been crushed, and Europe had been saved from renewed large-scale war. In the east, the Prussian army under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher played a decisive role in the final collapse. Their arrival turned a difficult battle into a complete defeat for France. Without them, the outcome might have been far less certain. But history does not deal in what-ifs. It deals in what happened. And what happened was the end of Napoleon's final campaign. In the days that followed, French political structures quickly unraveled. Support for Napoleon disappeared almost overnight. His allies abandoned him. His enemies moved quickly to restore control. Realizing there was no path forward, Napoleon abdicated once again. This time, there would be no second return. European leaders were determined not to repeat past mistakes. After years of continuous warfare, they wanted stability above all else. So they made a final decision. Napoleon would be removed from Europe entirely. He was sent into exile on the remote island of St. Helena. The location was deliberately chosen. It was isolated, heavily controlled, almost impossible to escape. There, far from the world he once dominated, Napoleon would spend the rest of his life under constant watch. A man who had once shaped empires now lived in confinement. A figure who had once commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers now walked alone. Across Europe, the consequences of his downfall spread quickly. Borders stabilized. Governments reorganized. Diplomats at the Congress of Vienna finalized the new European order. Kings returned to thrones. Old rivalries were managed through careful balance. The goal was simple. Prevent another Napoleon. Prevent another continental war. Maintain peace through stability and power balance. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, a different story was unfolding. The United States, having survived its war with Britain, began to grow with renewed confidence. The victory at New Orleans had already become part of national identity. General Andrew Jackson emerged as one of the most celebrated military figures in the country. His name became associated with resilience, determination, and victory against overwhelming odds. The war itself had officially ended with the Treaty of Ghent. Yet, in the minds of many Americans, the final image of the conflict was not diplomacy. It was the muddy battlefield outside New Orleans. 2 wars. 2 continents. 2 decisive turning points in world history. In Europe, Napoleon's defeat marked the end of revolutionary empires and the beginning of a long period of relative stability. In America, the defense of New Orleans strengthened national identity and confidence. Both events were shaped by slow communication, global timing, and unexpected consequences. And both demonstrated a powerful truth of history. Great moments are not always understood when they happen. Sometimes their meaning becomes clear only years later. Napoleon Bonaparte would die in exile on St. Helena. But his legacy would survive. Military strategy, political change, legal reforms, and the memory of an era when one man came closer than almost anyone to reshaping an entire continent. And in a different part of the world, the United States would continue to grow into a global power, carrying forward the confidence born from its early survival. The age of empires did not end with one battle, but it changed forever at Waterloo. And in a distant, unintended echo of timing and fate, another battle had already changed America at New Orleans. Together, they marked the closing of one chapter in world history, and the beginning of another. The end.